So maybe you are a squatting pro, or squatting or anything resembling such has been off your movement menu for a while. In either case, exploring how we get up and down out of a chair, which is a movement we probably do about 100 times a day, can be helpful in maintaining the longevity of your squatting ability or helping you move closer toward achieving one. So for this practice, you'll just need an ordinary household chair. Kitchen chairs are ideal in that they are flat and somewhat sturdy, as opposed to a cushy chair or couch, which will make that a little more challenging. Just have you take a seat. And we're just going to practice a couple times getting up and down out of the chair the way you normally would. Come up, come down, come up, come down. And as we do this, I want you to notice a couple of things in terms of what are you using to get up out of the chair. Are you pressing down into your knees, or maybe pressing down into the sides of the chair? Or if you happen to be using one with armrests to push up? Are you using momentum to heave yourself out of the gravitational field of the earth? And maybe some noises involved? And just making notes of that. So now we're going to slow this down to get a better idea of what it is you're actually relying on to get up out of the chair. So as we do this, I want you to start to go up, and instead of raising all the way up, can you pause just an inch or two above the chair and lower yourself down? So if this is already a challenge, this is helpful information. And if you are able to do this, to hold it and notice where you're feeling the pressure or the weight. Is it in your knees? Is it in your hips? Is it in where in the part of your feet? Is it in the front of the feet or your heels? And we'll come back down. All right, now we're going to start to make some tweaks to this movement, and maybe you are already doing these things, but if you're not, just take note as we go along here. So before you even start to rise from the chair, just note where your feet are. As you see where my knees are, my feet are a little bit behind my knees. Maybe when you go to get up, you immediately put them under your chair. Let's try bringing them out a little bit forward, either directly under the knees or maybe even just a little bit forward of the knees. So right here, you might already be feeling like you won't be able to get up out of the chair. So at this point, I'm going to have you hinge forward at your hips. So in other words, you're bringing the front of your pelvis closer to your thighs, not necessarily rounding the back. You're just bringing your whole torso to lean up forward so that your tailbone is coming up off the chair. Now you might feel your weight coming down more into your feet from here. And now you can either lightly place your hands on your knees, but ideally, let's bring them out in front. Can you bring your weight slowly over before you even come up off the chair to press down through your feet, and now elevate. And ideally, you're going to be feeling this back in here as opposed to the pressure on the knees. And then we're going to raise up. All right, and let's reverse that. So we're going to come down. Sit. So let's try that again. So noting where your feet are directly under the knees, as opposed to back closer toward the chair, where your knees are out in front of your toes. So directly under the knees or just a little bit forward. Keep your feet about hip width apart, so they're in line with the hips as well. Scooch to the edge of the chair if you need to, and you should feel your sit bones pressing into the bottom of the chair. And again, leaning forward like a skier's lunge, I guess. I've never skied, but that's a whole other story. All right, pressing forward, and then you're bringing that center of gravity to shift from off the chair more towards like the center of the legs almost, and you feel the pressure in your hips. Bring the arms out. Now the key here is to get your tailbone up off the chair before the rest of your butt, and then you're going to push down through your heels and elevate up. All right, so if this is still tricky for you, because if you haven't been using your glute muscles, to come up out of a chair. You've been really relying on putting the pressure on your knees or some of those other strategies we explored. You might need to elevate the level at which you're starting from. So you can use a book, you can use a yoga block that's going to bring your hips up a little bit higher than your knees. So the goal here as an exercise practice is to be able to get to a point where you can elevate yourself up with ease. You can elevate yourself down with ease, because the opposite of the momentum piece is gravity, where we get to about the last 2-6 inches and we plop into the chair. In both cases, it's indicative of the lack of availability of our glute muscle strength. So we're really trying to build that up as a way to come up with ease out of the chair and come down in such a way that you can lower with so much slowness, almost like you're going to sit on an egg and place yourself down. Not like you have to do this every time you get up and down out of a chair, but again, as an exercise practice, this is very helpful to do. And then getting to lower and lower levels where you're able to glide up and the chair pops every time I get up. Come up and then come down. Move the block. Leaning forward. Elevating up. So perhaps you've been practicing this chair squat, getting up and down out of the chair, but you're still not entirely sure if you're sussing out the difference in where to put your weight as far as over your knees or over your hips. We sometimes have ingrained habits, and even though it feels like we might be changing something, we're not exactly there yet. So if we are extracting the hinging part before we even put the load and the mechanism of getting up and down out of the chair, what this would look like is, again, we're looking to the shins as the key point of what's moving or not. So if we're bending the knees first, the shins are going to move out of their perpendicular position and come into more of an angle. If we keep the shins upright and yet hinge at the hips first, the shins can stay where they are and the knees don't move. See the difference there? Here's knees. The hips are still hinging, but the knees are hinging first. Keep the knees straight, hinging at the hips. Okay? So now we put them together, hinging at the hips, but still keeping the shins upright. There's more of the hinging happening here than it is in the knees. And it also requires that we bring our weight back more towards our heels. So we can do this by observing ourselves, perhaps in a mirror or on the camera as I'm doing here. We can also use a spotter here. So if you have a chair or something in front of you where you can still get your feet somewhat hip width apart. And you start with your knees touching the chair. Now if I'm going to bend forward and my knees are going to bend first, if my shins are moving, they're going to push the chair out of the way. So I'm going to let that cue me to hinge more at the hips and bring the weight more back into my heels. Okay, see the difference there? Hinging at the hips more, pushing the knees forward. So depending on where my weight is, if I'm more forward and over my knees, the chair has to move. If my weight is more coming back over the hips, which means that I really have to lift my tailbone here. You have to stick your butt up a little bit to keep your shins straight and coming up. And this is just a good isolated practice just to get used to both that movement as well as you start to generate some strength in your gluteal muscles. You can also go from a sitting position with the chair in front of you as well for an added challenge. You want to start bringing it into the context in which this is going to be used. You might need to fiddle with it just a little bit to get the right distance from your knees. Again, the difference between hinging forward and coming up. We're thrusting forward with the knees, moving the chair out of the way. So again, it's a practice. Coming forward, lifting up with ease and control, and without pushing the chair out of the way. Similarly, hinging at the hips, lowering down with ease. Well, I hope you found this tweak to a common everyday movement helpful for you, if not informative. Making such a small change to something that we do hundreds of times a day can have tremendous bearing on the longevity of your knees, the strengthening of the hip joints, and also something I didn't really talk about, but when momentum becomes a strategy for getting up out of a chair, in essence, what we're doing is we're thrusting our center of gravity forward off the center line, and then we have to recover to bring it back. When we're younger, those other systems are in place to be able to help us recover quickly, but one of the things that people find as they get older is that some of those other balancing mechanisms, if they're offline, that can be a very precarious and vulnerable moment of getting up. Because if you don't have the recovery systems to come back, then we end up falling forward. And this happens when we're walking as well or going upstairs. So being able to maintain as much muscular control within our bodies without relying on external supports, momentum included, can really help us maintain our uprightness and equilibrium. All right, there's so much to say about that, but I hope this was helpful for you. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me or write a comment, and I'll be happy to try to answer that. Thank you again.